So you want to build a PC? I'll show you. Hey guys, it's Chris with Tech5. Today we're going to be building a PC. And I'm going to be going step by step on all the processes throughout of building a PC if you want to follow along. Now, the PC that we're going to be using today will have all the parts listed in the description if you'd like to try to build this particular PC as well. Now, today's PC is a particularly powerful budget build, and I will say I did kind of go out and get a second-hand GPU just so I could achieve this. And there's kind of some risk involved in that, but I gotta say for this particular one, it paid off. So we're gonna get into this. Let's check this out. When building a PC, you want to make sure you have the right tools. Having a screwdriver set with magnetic tips can make a world of difference. If you're going to be in the PC building space, I recommend you get one. Now, an ESD strap helps if used properly to reduce the chances of electrostatic discharge, and if you do not have an anti-static work area like I do, it may be in your best interest to get one. Now, the first part you're going to want to start with when building a PC is going to be the motherboard. Think of the motherboard as the highway for sending out all the commands to the other parts of the PC. Today's motherboard is going to be an Intel motherboard. This is the B460M, and as I said, this is an Intel board, not to be confused with a Ryzen chip, which uses a completely different layout for its CPU. Now, this is going to be known as the I/O shield. We are going to need this later for the PC case, so keep that out of the box. Now, for today's build, we are not going to need these SATA cables. If you're using a magnetic drive or a regular SSD, you would need these, but we're using an M.2 for today, so you will actually need some screws like these if you were using an NVMe. Now that everything's out of the box, it's a good idea to go ahead and use the motherboard box as a workstation so we can install the CPU. The CPU today is going to be the Intel i3-10100. Now, you do want to make sure that you buy the right CPU. An Intel CPU must go to an Intel motherboard. To begin installing the CPU, you want to push down this lever here slightly and outwards. This will allow the mechanism to free the clasp and allow you to lift the mechanism so the CPU can be installed. Be sure the CPU is kept in its container until you are ready to install it. Now, when you are installing your CPU, it is imperative that you are putting the CPU in the right orientation, or it won't work properly. Now, CPUs typically are marked with a little small triangle in the corner, and the motherboard typically has some sort of marker on it to allow you to match up the triangle that's on the CPU. Once that's in, you can go ahead and close the mechanism once more, and when you have it all the way down and pushed inside, it should go ahead and pop out that little black piece. Save that for later. This is the heatsink. We're going to just be using the stock cooler, and the heatsink comes with thermal paste already pre-applied. It's going to be this little gray stuff that you don't want to get smeared. It has to be on the CPU. When installing this heatsink, make sure that you have the little arrows facing outwards from the heatsink and line up the holes surrounding the CPU that we just installed. Apply pressure until you hear a click and alternate your pressure. This helps apply the thermal paste equally. Once you've clicked in all four sides, go ahead and turn those arrows back in toward this heatsink so it will be locked in place and secure. Now from here, we're going to go ahead and plug in the CPU fan. This should be labeled on your motherboard as CPU fan, and it should be located right above the heatsink that we just installed. Now that we have a CPU fan installed, we can go ahead and move on to the RAM. The RAM can be found right next to the CPU that we just installed. Now, if you're using a different motherboard, you may be seeing 2 to 4 slots versus the 2 that we'll be working with today. Once you've located the RAM slots, go ahead and open up the clips so we're able to drop the RAM right in. To make sure that you install the RAM in the correct orientation, match up the notches on the RAM stick with the notches on the motherboard, and you can begin to push it in until you hear a click. For this build, we are using more than one stick, so we're going to go ahead and repeat the same process. Line up the notches with the RAM stick and the motherboard, and slide it in and push down till you hear that click. One way to go ahead and double check your work is looking at the clips at the very top that we talked about earlier. If they've actually come up, you should have done it right. Now, if you do need to go ahead and remove the RAM for some reason, you can push these down and you'll be able to remove it. If you've done it all right, it should look like this. At this point, we have installed the CPU and the RAM, and because we are using an M.2, we're going to install that now. Now you should be able to find the M.2 on your motherboard where you see this little black thing. This is known as the heatsink. For this particular motherboard, there is a heatsink for the M.2. You may not have one, but it'll look similar to this. When you begin to try to take off the M.2 heatsink, it has been my experience that these screws are much smaller. So as I said before, you want to make sure that you have a good set of magnetic screwdrivers because this is where they really come into handy. I do also like to use a magnetic bowl to keep all of my screws in place. I think this is a really great tool to have, and I definitely recommend it. Usually when you remove the M.2 heatsink, there is a protective film underneath. Leave this on. This is for the thermal pad underneath it. You want to wait till you actually install the M.2 before you peel it. Now, much like the RAM, there are notches on this M.2, and we are going to actually match up the notches on this M.2 with the slot here. So if you look, you can see the little notches that are in the M.2. You just want to slowly slide them into this little port here. And once you've got the M.2 inserted, you should get this little diving board type of feedback from pushing it down. That means you're good to go, and we can begin to reinstall our heatsink onto the M.2. Now, typically this is where you would actually use an M.2 screw, but for this particular motherboard, it is a M.2 screw and a placeholder for the heatsink of this M.2. Now, I mentioned it already a couple different times during this video, the importance of having a good set of magnetic tools when you're building a PC. These little screws are just so very small, and it's so easy to drop them, and it can be very frustrating if you do not have a magnetic tool set. Now, also, you do want to make sure when you are screwing in this M.2 heatsink that you don't just crank it down. You really don't need to do that. It doesn't take too much. Just get it snug, and once it's snug, you're good. You don't need to crank it down. You don't need to strongman it. When you've got it all done, it should look like this, and you should be good to move on to the next step. Now that we've got some of the more delicate items installed into the motherboard, we can go ahead and start getting the PC case together and fastening the motherboard to the PC case. So we'll get that out and get that going. Cooler Master's Masterbox Q300L is certainly a budget build case, but it does have its advantages. I've used this case a couple different times now in some builds, and I do have some frustrations with it, but at the same time, it does have its perks. It's a fairly inexpensive case, and it does get the job done. Now, we do not need the filters here, so we're going to go ahead and set those off to the side, and we can begin to go ahead and take off our side panels on this thing. And these are thumb screws, so you should be able to just easily turn them off. You shouldn't need a screwdriver for this part. Now, when building PCs or repairing PCs, I would say that it's best practice to go ahead and keep your work area as clean as possible when you are dealing with such small pieces. Things can easily get ruined, broken. You don't want to do that. Now, with the other side of this side panel, I have had to use a screwdriver. I've not been able to actually twist these off, even though these are thumb screws in a sense. You are going to want to just go ahead and have your screwdriver ready, because I've been through this case 3 different times now, and I've not actually been able to do it, so I just assume this is how it comes. So get the side panel off, and just like before, put it in your box. We're not going to need it for now. When you purchase a case new, usually you can find some hardware inside of the case. It comes in a little bag or in a little cardboard box, has some screws, has some zip ties, and has some silica stuff that you don't need. You can toss it out. But you will have different hardware that is specific to your case, and you want to make sure that you are keeping track of that, because you may need it. And for this particular case, you're able to actually move the IO button anywhere around the case if you want to. You can put it on either side if you choose to do so. We're not going to do that here, but you do have that option. Now, anytime you install a motherboard, it will have to be fastened to a standoff. This is a standoff here that I have in my hand. Now, for this particular case, they don't pre-install the standoffs, and I assume that's because they allow you to have the customizability. If you're using a micro ATX board or an ITX board, whatever size board, they allow you to put the standoffs in yourself and have it at whatever orientation you need. Now, the standoffs will need to be put in and fastened securely, and you can use this little tool here to do so. Trying to do it by hand doesn't work out very well. Now, if you need to make sure where you need to put these standoffs, there are little holes that are on your motherboard, and you will line up the standoffs with these little holes on your motherboard. Now, once you've done that, you're ready for your IO shield, and you can put that in. To properly orientate your IO shield, just look for the little circles, and you can have these on the bottom. This makes it really easy to remember. This is where the 3.5mm jacks go, but just remember the little 3 circles. Usually makes it really easy. Make sure that the little pins, little metal pins, are pushed out. Do not have them going into the case, because if you do that, you can accidentally get them in your ports, and if they get into your ports, you can accidentally short something out, and that's never a good day. Now, push the little IO shield from the inside until you hear a little pop. Push it on all 4 corners until you see that it's fastened, and you should be good to go. Now, once your IO shield is fastened in place, you're going to want to make sure that you have the standoffs in the right place. Remember to check the holes on your motherboard to know that you can properly place your motherboard and everything is going to line up. You want to begin to drop in your motherboard slowly and push it towards the IO shield. And once you have that all lined up with your standoffs and your IO shield, you're ready to begin fastening your motherboard to the case. Now, it's been my experience that with this case, they do not provide you the proper hardware for mounting a motherboard to the case. Now, if you're going to be in the PC building area or space, I would recommend that you get your own assortment of screws just like this, because it definitely comes in handy when you run into situations such as this. Make sure that you have the right thread width for the screw and begin to go around and install a screw in every place that you see a standoff and a little hole for your motherboard. Before moving on to the next step in the PC building process, make sure you double check and make sure that a standoff has been mounted to the case for every hole that needs it. You want to make sure that your motherboard is properly mounted, and once it is, we can move on to putting in the power supply. We're going to be using the 500 watt EVGA 80 plus white power supply. This is a non-modular power supply by EVGA. Now, EVGA isn't the only one that produces these, but non-modular just basically means that the plugs that come with the power supply cannot be interchanged, they cannot be taken out. What it comes with is what it comes with. And this is what you'll typically find in budget builds because they're just much cheaper and they're fixed and it's easy. Now, this other plug is what's going to actually go into the wall. We'll use that later, we don't need that right now. And we're going to use these screws that we've got to actually mount the power supply to the case. Now, I'm not a particular fan of how they did this case here. The power supply has to be mounted to a bracket, which is then mounted to the case. And it's kind of bothersome, really, for lack of a better word for it. But you just simply take this bracket here and you'll screw the bracket to the power supply, and from there you'll screw the bracket to the case. Now, for this particular case, we're going to have our fan facing down because we do not want to fight our GPU for air. So to do that, we're going to make sure that the orientation of the bracket here is in this direction. It can get kind of confusing if you try to turn it around, so just try to pay attention to the video here. I've fought with this thing before, trial and error. So like I said before, we're going to have the fan on this thing facing down because we don't want to fight our GPU for air. If we had this up, our GPU and our fan would be pulling in completely different directions and fighting each other for the airflow. And we're already going to be limited in this case for airflow, so we're going to go ahead and make sure this thing is facing down in this orientation. So you get it in there, push it towards the back, and line up the support bracket with the screw holes and then screw it in. And if you've done it all correctly, it should look like this. So while we're doing the build, we're going to actually try to do some cable management as we go, just to try to make it easier on ourselves. So right here, since we've got the power supply installed, we're going to go ahead and try to feed these cables toward the back of the case so we can go ahead and get them routed and out of the way. And like I said, just managed as much as we possibly can as we build. It just makes the whole flow process that much easier and better. So I would suggest doing cable management as you go, as you can. Now I had mentioned that airflow in this case would be limited, and the reason for that is because of the lack of fan headers on this motherboard. I made the assumption that this motherboard came with more than one, and that just simply was not the case. And you know what they say about assuming. So they got a case of the ASSU me going on right now. So I apologize, we are going to be lacking some intake fans on this one. I wasn't prepared and I didn't have the extra pieces for fan splitters, but you can simply solve this if you do get the fan splitters yourself. Now, as I mentioned, we want to do as much cable management as we can as we go, so we're going to actually hook up the HD audio and the 3.0 USB on the motherboard right now. Now we're going to start off with the HD audio, and this is marked as HD audio, and you can find the header for this on the far left bottom of the motherboard. Now we're going to go ahead and try to route this around, but you can make sure you have the right orientation by looking at the pins. It should show a missing pin on the header, and you should see it on the plug itself. If you've got it in there right, you should be easily fitting it. Don't try to force it. It should go on fairly easy. Now we're going to go ahead and move on to the USB 3. Now this thing you do want to be particularly careful with. It has a little notch here to make sure you got the right orientation, but when you are plugging it in, make sure you do it right, because you can easily bend the pins on the motherboard with this thing if you accidentally force it in too much and don't have it all lined up correctly. So make sure you do this one right. Now these are going to be known as the front panel connectors. Now we're actually not going to mess with these just yet, but we'll come back to them later. Now we do have something special here, but we are going to continue to mess with cables. Now what we have here are the cable extensions. Now these things are completely unnecessary. These are just to make the build look better. Now you see here that coming out of the power supply, we got what are known as ketchup and mustard cables. They're kind of ugly, and these are just a way to dress up the build. Just an additional cost, not needed in any sort of way. But remember, these are extensions. If for some reason you do get a modular build or a modular power supply, these will not be something you plug directly into the power supply. These only go into the cables. These are only extensions. Now, we're going to start off with the 24-pin power cable extension. This goes directly into the motherboard, and we want to make sure we have a good orientation on these things. Now the best orientation for this, and to make it look the best, we're going to take these cable combs here and we're going to actually line it up with the motherboard and see which way is going to actually be showing. And that's going to be where we want to actually put these cable combs. Gives it the best look and keeps the cables the cleanest. Now when you're applying these, you do want to do it one row at a time. It makes it the easiest and you're less likely to mess up. Now you can do about 3 of these cable combs on here. You can do more if you want, kind of user preference, but it looks good with 3. If you'd like to do more, go for it. Now once you get this in here, make sure you get it snapped, you get a good fix, good fit, and then you just route it to the back, and you can see that it actually gives it a really clean look. And that's what we're going for here. We're trying to make it look as good as we can. Now here we're going to move on to the CPU, and we're going to do something very similar. But one of the particular things you want to make sure with the CPU is that you are using the right cable extension. Now, some of these cables may not exactly go all interchangeable, and they are specific to a certain plug. And for this particular one, if you look on the ends, you may have different shapes for the plugs, and one of these cables will not fit on the CPU, so make sure you plug in the right one. So we've got those plugged in, but we got to make sure that they're actually plugged into the actual power supply cables. So what we're going to do is do that. We're going to start with the motherboard right now. So you're going to look for the big cable, the 24 pin cable on the back, and we're going to plug that into our extension because, well, they are extensions. Now, a lot of these cables you aren't going to actually need because of how we've got this set up. We're only using an NVMe, so all these peripherals cables, we're not going to actually need them. We only need the CPU cable, the motherboard cable, and the PCIe cable. A lot of these cables are usually labeled, so you shouldn't be too confused as to what goes where. Now here we're just getting rid of cables that we're not actually using and kind of managing them with twist ties because I definitely prefer them. And like I said, we're going to plug in our motherboard cable into our extension cable. So make sure you've got it in the right orientation, plug it up, get a secure fit, you should get a snap. And we're just doing a little bit of cable management as we go because that's the most effective way to do this. And that leaves us with one cable left, the PCIe. And that means it's time for the GPU. So let's get that going. Now for the GPU, we're going to be using the Sapphire Nitro R9 Fury. Now, this was a pretty dang good pickup that I got for about $100, and honestly you can't beat that with the performance that it gives. Now I did go ahead and go a little bit further beyond, and I took this thing apart and I repasted it, put new thermal pads on it because I really wanted to get the most out of this thing that I could. Now we're ready to go ahead and install the GPU. Now for this particular case, we do have to break away some of the metal here, and this is so we can go ahead and make sure we have the right amount of slots open for the GPU. And for this GPU, we need to have 2 spots open. Now you do want to be careful doing this so you don't break something on the motherboard trying to rip off these metal pieces. I've seen it, you don't want to do it, be careful. And once you have those off, you can go ahead and begin to insert the GPU. Now you want to make sure that you are lining up the slots with the GPU and make sure that you are looking at the ridges, looking at the indentions, and matching it up with the GPU. So go ahead and get it in there and just drop it in. You don't have to do too much pushing, you don't have to apply too much pressure. Once you've got it in there, it should latch on, do a little click, and then you're good. Now that we got the GPU in there, we want to make sure that it's secured, and we're going to do that by taking the bracket that we took off earlier and putting it back on. Now, when we have that bracket piece back on there, we do want to make sure it's fastened by screws, and we're going to use the same screws that we used for the power supply. We'll go ahead and put those in the same place that the GPU has metal pieces on the side, and we'll go ahead and screw those in, those 2 screws, and then we'll screw one into the back here. So it should be a total of 3 screws that we're putting in, and then that should give us a pretty good fit. Now if you have it all installed right, it should look like this, but we do have 2 PCIe ports left to worry about, and we do have 2 extension cables left. Now we'll go ahead and get those in, but before we do that, we're gonna go ahead and install this GPU bracket. Now what this does is give some extra support to our GPU, which we've got a heavy boy in here, and this just simply helps the motherboard in holding up the GPU.
GPUs this size are only getting bigger, and it can definitely cause some unnecessary strain on the motherboard slot and can eventually ruin your motherboard if you aren't careful. So we've got that in there, and now we're going to move on to actually putting in these extensions. Now, much like before, you want to make sure the orientation has the combs faced in a direction that's going to make them look the best. We've got 2 of them. We're going to get those in there, and it looks like we can fit about 3 to 4 of those combs on there. Going to be user preference on this. Now, we've got those in there, so we're going to route those to the back. And once we have those in there, we are looking pretty dang good. Now, we can actually plug them in to the actual cables themselves, so we'll do that. And once those are plugged in, make sure there's a snug fit, a secure fit, a good clip, and then we can do some more cable management. Now, I typically like to do the front panel last, but in this case it's not the most ideal way because there's just not that much room in the case. But when you are hooking up the front panel, you want to refer to your motherboard manual because they're not always the same in the orientation that they go. The plugs just don't always line up, but typically they are always on the far right. So just remember, front panel is going to be on the far right, and look at your manual to find out exactly where each plug's going to go. Now, to finish off this PC build, we have just a little bit of cable management left. Now, me personally, I don't like to do very tight cable management. I think it makes it very difficult to come in and make changes when changes need to happen, and working with computers, you can pretty much guarantee that something's going to happen. So for that reason, I prefer to use twist ties. I think that they're a cleaner solution, and I think that they make it much easier for everybody involved. The over tight cable management thing doesn't work for me. As you can see, it's good, it's not the greatest, but it gets the job done. And here we are on the home stretch of this thing. Just have to put on this back panel here, throw on these 4 screws. We're about to be done. PC build in under 30 minutes. We've done it, we did it. That's how you do it. Now, one last thing to do is just to turn this thing on and pray to the Lord above that it comes on, because we didn't test it before. We didn't test it outside the box. Oh, it worked. Thank God. So, PC's running. We're gonna set up the rest, get a quick glimpse. But first, we gotta get this little plastic pill going.
So I do want to go ahead and admit some issues that I did have making this video. I had quite a bit of technical difficulties. The main camera that I was using kept shutting off and wouldn't stay recording, and I ended up having to use my overhead camera to do the main camera filming, and then I switched my phone to the overhead, and I couldn't even use that footage because it got corrupted somehow, and it's just it was a huge headache. It was really just bad, and I wanted this one to be really good, and I think it turned out better than the last one, but it's still not on the level that I wanted to have it on, so I apologize for that. But the next one, I'll continue to try to make sure it's better. So just forgive me, keep working with me, I'll get better, I promise. Now, you guys know I gotta shout out my Patreon, so thank you guys so very much for supporting a small YouTuber such as myself. Outside of being a subscriber, I really appreciate it. Every little bit counts and every little bit helps, so thank you so very much. If you're a subscriber, thank you for being subscribed to the channel. I appreciate your support as well, and if you're a viewer, thank you for making it this far to the video. That's gonna do it for the video. As always, if you do have any questions, concerns, confusions, whatever it may be, ask. I don't mind helping. I'm really trying to build something for you guys here, and I hope you'll want to be a part of it. A simple like, share, a subscribe, a comment, they go so far for the channel. They really help me continue to make content and grow. If there was something you didn't like, thought I could have done better, whatever it may be, please feel free, leave a thumbs down. I just ask you to let me know what it was so I can continue to improve and do better. Now, with that said, I hope you can like, I hope you can subscribe. And if not, well, I hope to catch you in another one. And remember, it's a vibe. A tech vibe, specifically. We'll see you.